Hey, this is Mr. Bordelon, and today we're going to be talking about equilibrium. Okay, so pretty much a lot of the work you've done for equilibrium is already done with demand and supply, so a lot of this is going to be pretty straightforward. Let's start off with a demand and supply schedule on this end. So, not starting there, price, of course, is going to increase from $1 up to $5 to comply with the quantity demanded. We'll see that as price increases, quantity demanded will decrease. And as price increases for the law of supply, quantity supplied will increase. Okay, so how does this work on this end? Well, let's go ahead and draw an equilibrium graph like that. Okay, notice on the x-axis here, I'm just drawing Q. It's understood now that we're talking about quantity demanded and quantity supplied together, so we don't need the subscript there. All right, price will go there. Now let's go ahead and do demand and supply. So this is your basic equilibrium graph on this end. Now, let's identify, how this works on the table. If you had to choose something on the table, for to be equilibrium, what would that necessarily be? Well, if you chose $3, that's correct. Okay, so let's go ahead and erase. This is equilibrium price. This is equilibrium quantity. And this, of course, is equilibrium. Now let me just kind of erase this part right here. And, of course, it's going to do that. Draw that back in. And we'll draw that back in there. Okay. So let's go ahead and use these real numbers, to kind of highlight this as we go. So here's $3. And here's 6 in terms of our quantity. Now, this is going to be our equilibrium point on this end. So, how do we define equilibrium? Equilibrium is going to be where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. And that's how you define equilibrium. No more, no less. Now, notice that, what I'm saying here is quantity demanded and quantity supplied. I'm not saying demand equals supply. Okay. We still have to comply with the laws of demand and supply on this end. So, it's got to be a change in price, which affects a change in quantity. So this is why we refer to this as equilibrium on this end. Now, what if we had a price of, say, $1? According to that, let's just draw in some little ant trails here. We would have a quantity supplied of 2 and a quantity demanded of 10. Now, that puts us in a situation where quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. And that's going to refer to these two numbers right here. This idea is called a shortage. A shortage occurs whenever quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. That's it. That's all a shortage is. Okay. And something else, shortage is not the same thing as scarcity. Scarcity is always occurring. Okay, you can never get rid of it. But a shortage is a temporary market condition on this end. So here's the thing. One of the things you're going to be expected to do is measure the amount of the shortage. Well, to do that, you're basically going to be measuring from that gap to that gap, to that point to that point. So 10 minus 2, in this case, 8. That's the amount of shortage you have here. All right. You're also going to be expected to have to do it from the table. So let's say at $2, my quantity demanded is 8.4. Okay, so 8 minus 4 is 4. So to find the amount of shortage, you just simply take quantity demanded minus quantity supplied. That's all you're going to be doing here. All right. But now let's say that I have a price above equilibrium. All right, so let's go ahead and use $5 up here. And that gives me a quantity demanded of 2. I'm going to pretend that matches up and make that a quantity supplied of 10. All right. So this is a situation where we have quantity supplied greater than quantity demanded. And that is a surplus. Surplus occurs whenever quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. And that's that gap here. All right. So how do you measure this? Well, you're essentially going to be doing the same gap point to point as you did with a shortage. So in this case, 10 minus 2 is 8. So my surplus at $5 is 8. At $4, 8 minus 4 is 4. So my surplus at $4 is 4. Mathematically, that comes out as quantity supplied minus quantity demanded. So how do I get rid of a shortage or surplus? Because here's the thing about this. The tendency for the market is to always go back to equilibrium because that's where people are happiest. Buyers are buying the thing they want to buy at the price they want to buy it for. Sellers are selling the thing they want to sell at the price they want to sell it for. That's equilibrium on this end. Well, remember the laws of demand and supply. And this is where they come into play. If ultimately the tendency is to go back to equilibrium, well, for a shortage, all I would have to do is raise the price. And when I do that, I get rid of these consumers and I'm gaining back these producers. Similarly, if we're talking about this guy, who's making the surplus, we're going to lower the price and that's going to get rid of these extra producers and I'm going to gain these consumers back. And we end up back at equilibrium at $3 at 6 quantity. So that's the basic read of how you read an equilibrium graph. All right. But now let's talk about shifts in equilibrium. There's 3 types of scenarios that you're going to see. Okay. The first is there's going to be a change in demand with no change in supply. We're going to work on those first. The second is a change in supply with no change in demand. And then finally, a change in both demand and supply at the same time. So, drawing these out. Now, you already know what shifts demand on this end, so you don't have to worry about learning anything new. You're just applying what you've already learned on this end. And make sure you're keeping the idea of increase and decrease on this end. So, let's say that I have an increase in demand. All right, that's going to be a shift to the right. And I have a decrease in demand. That's going to be a shift to the left. All right. Using shorthand on this end, we would say as demand increases, well, what happens to price and quantity? Well, here's Q1 and P1. And here's Q2 and P2. So according to this, price and quantity are both going to increase. Now, that should raise some red flags because you're like, wait a minute. I thought we just said the law of demand, is that price would increase and quantity will decrease. Hold on to that just a minute, okay? If we're looking at a decrease in demand, we're dropping from P1 to P3, and we're going here. So demand is going to decrease, and as demand decreases, we see that price is going to decrease and quantity is going to decrease. What in the world is going on here? Okay. Well, here's the thing. You're not seeing, you didn't learn the law of demand wrong. The law of demand is still as price increases, quantity demanded will decrease and vice versa. Okay. What you're seeing in this shorthand, to ultimately make sense of the shifts is demand and supply, the laws of them working together. Okay. Let me explain this way. Okay. Let's say that initially when we increased from P1 to P3, okay, that price stayed the same. Now, if that's the case, okay, that means I've created something like right here. Now that should look familiar to you from just a few minutes ago. That looks like a shortage. Well, how do I get rid of a shortage? I raise the price, which is what I've done down here. When I raise the price, what happens to quantity supplied? It's going to increase. So these are the laws of demand and supply working together in tandem. Similarly, let's do the opposite side now, okay? Let's assume just for a moment that the price, when demand initially decreased, stayed the same. Well, now this shape is familiar. Ultimately, I've created a surplus. How do you get rid of a surplus? You lower the price, which is what we did. When I lower the price, what happens to the quantity supplied? It's going to decrease. So understand that's the reason why you're looking at this. And the one thing I want to make sure you're doing here is you're reading your graph. This is important to learn how to write in terms of the shorthand, but don't try to memorize these as rules. You'll drive yourself insane and you're not going to learn them that way. What you need to learn, the skill you need to learn, is reading the graph. Now, let's do this on the opposite side. Let's say now that we're going to do a change in supply with no change in demand. So, quantity, price, demand, supply 1, supply 2, supply 3. Okay? So supply is increasing from S1 to S2, and it's decreasing from S1 to S3. All right? So how in the world does this work? So let's say that we have an increase in supply. Well, let's do the rabbit trails. Price 1, price 2. Quantity 1, quantity 2. So here's my first equilibrium, and here's my new second equilibrium. Okay. So in this particular case, my price decreased, but my quantity increased. Now again, that looks like the law of demand, and that should seemingly raise some flags. All right. Now, what if we were to do the other side? We're going to see a decrease in supply, so that increases my price and decreases my quantity. So what in the world is going on here? Well, think about it as if ultimately the price was staying the same initially and that supply increased. If that's the case, look at what shape I have here. This looks like a surplus. Okay? Well, how do I get rid of a surplus? I lower the price, which is what I did. When I lower the price, what happened to quantity demanded? It increased. Similarly, if I were to go on this side, where supply decreases, I've created essentially a shortage. Okay? Well, how do I get rid of a shortage? I raise the price, which is what I've done here. When I raise the price, what happens to quantity demanded? It's going to decrease. Okay? So that's the shorthand of this in terms of reading up what's going on here. And if you're wondering why this seems separate, somehow the laws of demand and supply were not working, this is why. They're actually working. They're just working together. And so make sure, that you're reading your graphs. That's the skill you want to take from this. So that brings us ultimately to what happens when you have a change in demand and supply at the same time. All right. So let's say I have change in demand and a change in supply. Let's say that we're going to have an increase in demand and an increase in supply at the same time. So there's demand, and we'll go ahead and increase it now, just to make it easier for us. Supply 1, supply 2. Now let's draw in the little ant trails for our equilibriums. So here's E1, here's E2, and we'll draw that here. E1. All right, so in this scenario, demand and supply increased. So as you see that happening, well, what happened to price? According to this, price increased, and quantity also increased. But here's the problem. The question is, did it really? Let's do this again. We're going to do an increase in demand and supply at the same time. So here's demand 1. Here's demand 2. Supply 1. Supply 2. So here is E1, here is E2, and drawing in the ant trails. So here's price 1, price 2, Q1, Q2. Okay, so now we have an increase in demand and an increase in supply. And look what happened to price. According to this, price decreased, but quantity increased. How can I come up with two separate answers for the same question? Well, the answer lies in the difference between these two graphs. If you noticed, I drew one shift of demand and supply bigger than the other in each one. And that's the problem, okay? Understand something. All I told you was that demand and supply were going to increase together. I didn't tell you by how much. So we're just making an assumption that, one's bigger than the other. But we can't. We can't make that assumption without more information. So what you have to do instead is you have to draw them equidistantly. But notice something that ultimately is happening here that we know for sure occurred when demand and supply increased. Quantity increased both times. Keep that in the back of your mind. So, same idea on this end. I'm going to make this graph a little bit bigger because we're going to use both sides here. So here's demand 1. Here's demand 2. Here's supply 1. Here's supply 2. Okay? So now let's draw in the ant trails. E2, E1, and equilibrium price. Okay? So this is essentially what our graph looks like. Now, here's the thing. Notice before what we said over here, that we know when demand and supply increased, quantity increased. And sure enough, it did. Well, the question is, what happened to price? Well, your initial reaction is to say that price ultimately didn't change. But actually, we don't know, do we? Coming back to this, price either increased or decreased depending on which shift was bigger. But we have no idea what that information is. So in that particular instance, what we will say is that price is indeterminate, but quantity is increasing. Okay. Now, here's the thing. You now have enough information to solve the opposite. Demand decreases, supply is also going to decrease. What's going to happen to price and quantity? Well, draw it out and keep it equidistant. Demand is decreasing here from D1 to D3, and supply is decreasing from S1 to S3. Drawing in the ant trail, we get the third quantity. Quantity decrease, but we still have no idea what price is because we don't know which shift is bigger between demand and supply. So this is indeterminate. Now, what if they're moving in opposite directions? Okay. Well, this was actually one of the homework problems that I know that some of you guys had. All right. So, let's erase that part because I'd like to keep it in colors. So, let's say that supply decreases at the same time demand is increasing. Okay, so demand is increasing, supply is decreasing. Now let's go on our ant trails. Here's the first equilibrium. Here's the second equilibrium. Make that P2, and I'll draw that a little higher. There's price. And voila. There we go. So, what do we know for sure? Price increased. The question is, what happened to quantity? Well, quantity looks like it's staying the same, right? But remember, we don't know which shift is bigger. So ultimately what we would say instead is quantity is indeterminate. And that's the issue. All right. But you also now have enough information to do the opposite here. Demand decrease and supply increases. Well, let's ultimately figure this out. So let's say that again, demand decreases and supply is going to increase. So drawing in the relevant ant trails. 3. Price decreases and quantity is indeterminate. Now, if this kind of freaks you out, don't worry too much. This is literally one multiple choice question on the AP macro and micro exam, and that's it. I swear. Okay? So what you want to do, though, is you want to draw these out. Don't try to memorize this as a pattern. Okay? They're going to give you some kind of fact pattern, fact situation, and they're going to ask you to essentially say, well, okay, well, what are these things? What you want to do, okay, is you want to make sure that you can answer, with a graph. And don't be afraid if one of the answers is indeterminate, okay? Because that's okay. Sometimes the answer is that we don't have an answer. You want to make sure you can ultimately provide that. But what I don't want you to do is try to memorize this shorthand and try to memorize these graphs on this end. It won't happen. You'll never learn it. And the skill you need to learn is how to draw a graph and how to read the graph. So go at it. That's what I have for you. You guys have a good day, and you take care. Bye-bye.